is a leading scholar and author on neurodiversity whose work has been foundational to the emerging field of neurodiversity studies. She is a core faculty member in the undergraduate psychology program at CIIS, senior Aikido instructor at the Aiki Arts Center in Berkeley, author of the book Neuroqueer Heresies, and co-editor of multiple volumes of the annual Neuroqueer Lit anthology Spoon Knife. And so I would like to welcome Dr. Nick Walker and welcome all of you. Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Damali. Thanks for having me here. And good morning, everybody. So I came into today, I'll say two things. First, I came in with no idea what to expect, certainly in terms of audience size or even what our format would be, whether we'd be in conversation and dialogue or I would be talking and presenting. This is also my second presentation today, thanks to the miracle of Zoom. I just finished presenting in Scotland, even though I was here in Berkeley the whole time. And it's like late afternoon or evening or something for them there. So I just finished presenting at the It Takes All Kinds of Minds conference in Scotland. And last I saw it was kind of blowing up on Twitter. And so I'll look forward to coming back to that when I'm finished spending this time with all of you. And it's great, of course, to be here back from Scotland and with my own beloved CIIS community that I've been a part of for a long time. So I want to allow a lot of time for Q&A because for me, that's where it gets the richest. That's where the really rich conversations happen, is when we're actually in conversation with each other. And I try to spend as little time as possible talking at people and as much time as possible actually responding to people. But let me talk a little bit about this idea of changing the conversation on autism at CIIS. I was really thrilled when Damali invited me to take part in this session of the inner work, because I love the idea of the inner work. We talk a lot in terms of social justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion. We talk a lot about systemic change because there are all sorts of systemic changes that are necessary. We have all manner of oppressive systems and systemic inequalities in place. But increasingly, I'm of the view that the inner work is absolutely essential to this, that if we focus entirely on systemic change, we miss the real essence of the work. Has to happen internally. No matter how good a system one puts together, no matter how one reforms and changes the systems are still only as good as the people in them. And you can have a wonderful system with a great deal of equity set up, and all of the structures of the system are designed for justice. And yet if the people within the system are conducting themselves in a highly reactive way and clinging to old prejudices and such, it doesn't really matter how good the system is. Similarly, even the process of changing systems, if we're looking at, okay, clearly systemic changes need to be made in this world, how do we change it? How do we change our systems and structures? Well, that's an act of collaborative creativity. It doesn't really work well top down if you have some authoritarian figure handing down these changes. that itself is still in line with old oppressive systems. And good systemic change, this is a collaborative act. And for people to collaborate well on the creation of new systems or the transformation of old systems, that requires inner work. That requires people doing the inner work of becoming good collaborators. So that means transcending patterns of reactivity. It means transcending that reactive state of being governed by one's own ego defenses, and instead being able to interact mindfully and empathically with others. And so that's what the phrase "the inner work" conjures for me right away, is that whole set of ideas. And so I want to talk about that in relation to this concept of change in the conversation on autism at CIIS, is just the sense of doing the inner work of empathy for non-autistic people, to look at how to do that inner work. And so what happens when I come to present on autism, and this is true when I teach my undergraduate neurodiversity studies course, and this is true when I present anywhere on autism, when I talk to academics or professionals, therapists and such, about working with autistic people, when I talk about revising the curriculum around and just how we talk about autistic people, all of that. What happens is that people want me to educate them about autism, but that is not what I'm here to do. What I'm here to do is to encourage people to be empathic and just, and to have developed this empathy and sense of putting yourself in the shoes of the other, of someone who is the other to you, someone who's not like yourself. And you don't have to understand a person to do that. You don't have to understand their experience. You don't have to understand another person's experience in order to treat them well, because we've all experienced maltreatment. And so we should ideally all have the capacity to empathize with others who are experiencing maltreatment, and to say, I want to treat this person better. And I don't have to understand them in order to do that. I don't have to have this person explained to me in order to understand what basic decent conduct is. So let's think about this in terms of empathy. Autism right now is pathologized. It's in the DSM. It's treated as a pathology, and as part of that long history of autism being pathologized is that the discourse on autism and the world of professional practice around autism and education around autism and around autistic people, that discourse is run by non-autistic people. That what you read in textbooks and are taught in classes about autism and about autistic people, and what's out there in the popular culture, that's almost entirely stuff by non-autistic people for non-autistic people. It's a discourse around a marginalized and silenced group that's being done by people who are talking over that group. And so the popular conception of how to talk about autistic people is very different from the preferences of the majority of the autistic community. And the gay community has historically been in a very similar situation. When I was a kid, being gay was pathologized. You know, it was like homosexual paraphilia in the DSM. It was a diagnosis, and you could be institutionalized for it and subjected to all these involuntary treatments. And the academic teaching and psychology programs and such around being gay was this is some form of mental disorder that needs to be treated. And that's how it was talked about. And it was a common experience. You know, you come into a psychology class, you know, psychopathology, psych assessment class, child development class, and what you learn about homosexuality is that it's this mental disorder, and these are the therapies we use to treat it, to try to cure people of it. And of course, for gay people who are sitting in those classrooms, often, you know, in the closet, that's a terrible experience. This is terrible experience of marginalization. If here you are sitting in the classroom, listening to the teacher explain, you know, it's in the textbook. The teacher is explaining, the textbook is explaining how you are defective and you have this disorder, and this is how we need to treat it. And the assumption is that no one in the room is gay. You know, that was the assumption. You know, the textbook readers aren't gay. This is us, you know, this is us normal people talking about those gay people and how we treat them, because of course, you know, a gay person would never actually be in a psychology classroom. And that's how it is for autistic people today. So you can think about, you know, what that was like, you know, for queer people of all sorts back when homosexuality was being pathologized. And of course, trans people still encounter that frequently in the classroom. That's the situation autistic people are in now. The things we hear about ourselves in the classroom and in our textbooks are just devastating. It's very clear that we're not regarded as human, and it's hard to sit in a classroom and hear that stuff, and to read the textbooks of the profession that we're going into and studying, our academic field, and hear that stuff. And so what I what I ask in terms of doing the inner work is to think about that, and especially for faculty. What do you say about autism and autistic people in the classroom if you're teaching on that subject? What do the books that you assign and the articles that you assign, what do the assigned readings in your class say about autistic people? And how would you feel about having this said about you and about a member of a group that you belong to? And how do you think the autistic people in the class that you don't know about feel about this? There's a lot of autistic students at CIIS who are not out to the faculty and administration, because it is very clear from the way we're talked about in the classroom, and it's very clear from the textbooks that are assigned and what those textbooks say about us, that we are not safe being out of the closet as autistic people in this school. So they all know who I am. So I hear from the autistic students. If you're a faculty member in this, if you're present right now, a CIIS faculty member, I want you to know I'm hearing from your autistic students about how they don't feel safe in your classroom because of what you say about autistic people. And it's not just the psych programs. I hear about this from, in regard to other programs too, because autistic, autism is used in, a wide variety of different fields as a metaphor for being inhuman, as a metaphor for not being fully human and for being incapable of human connection. Like autism shows up in the literature on like spirituality and environmentalism. And I mean, there's like, there's an eco-psychology textbook that gets assigned at CIIS that has like, the distinguished Ralph Metzner writing about how using autism as a metaphor for disconnection from nature, and how it's the future of the world is truly hopeless if people are going to act like they're autistic. And this stuff gets assigned at CIS. Now imagine if that was being, if textbooks were being assigned we're talking that way about just about any other marginalized group, right? Imagine, I think at this point, I mean, we know that CIIS is not perfect in its treatment, far from perfect in its treatment of students of various marginalized groups. It's not perfect in how it deals with all manner of marginalized groups here. But if you were to assign in a CIIS classroom a textbook that talked about the importance of treating kids who appeared to be gay to make sure they didn't grow up to be gay, or to get them to act more straight, or if you were assigned a textbook that used homosexuality as a metaphor for being perverse and inhuman in some way, if you were to actively advocate for gay conversion therapy in the classroom, there would be a serious outcry. There would, that's not something you would, that would go over well at CIIS. I don't think that, I think that there would be massive complaints, not just from queer students, but even from straight students about it, and that a faculty member just would not get away with that. But that's when it's autistic people you're talking about, that seems totally acceptable still at CIIS. And so think, what I'm saying is develop the empathy around, well, how would you feel if you were being talked about that way in the texts that you were reading? If the teacher were talking about you that way. So, people would be looking a little funny, I think, at teachers. If a teacher was talking about gay people in the class as people with homosexuality, people experiencing homosexual feelings, people experiencing homosexuality, people suffering from homosexuality. I mean, that would be pretty obviously homophobic, I think. You don't talk about it in that pathologizing language, and yet there's still teachers at CIIS who think it's perfectly acceptable to say people with autism. And that language, that stigmatizing language, people with autism, that so-called person-first language, was developed a few decades ago over the objections of the autistic community by autistophobic people, who were in the business of pathologizing autism and selling so-called autism cures, selling conversion therapy for autistic people. That language has done enormous harm to the autistic community, and the autistic community has been fighting it for decades. And there's not really any excuse for not knowing that anymore. It's been ongoing enough. Anyone who cares enough to find out what the actual autistic community thinks about how the actual autistic community wants to be talked about, anyone who cares enough to even just like do a very small amount of, research of basic Googling or something is going to find out very easily that autistic people have been fighting against person first language for like 3 decades now and want to be called autistic people, and that it's an active slap in the face to every autistic person in the room when you say people with autism. There's no excuse for not knowing that the only people who don't know that are the people who haven't bothered to find out how autistic people want to be talked about. And I guarantee with just about any other marginalized group, at CIIS, the teachers are going to take some time and say, let me look at my textbooks and see, is this language offensive to the community it's talking about? And is this, what's the proper language here? What's the respectful language to talk about this community? And it's very obvious that no one does that in regard to how we talk about autistic people. And very few people at CIIS have bothered to do that work. And it's not a lot of work to find out. And so, again, what it takes is the inner work of actually caring. What it takes is the inner work of saying, it actually matters to me what autistic people are feeling, what the autistic people in my class that are probably there, even if they haven't come out to me, what are the autistic people in my class going to feel about this language? How does that community want to be talked about? What's the respectful way? And, I'm here as a resource, and some people come to me about it, and a lot don't. A lot of the time I hear about the students because students contact me often, in tears, because of how they were talked about in a classroom by a teacher, or how they were talked about when they went to student accessibility services, and people at student accessibility in the student accessibility services office used pathologizing language and talking about them, and had all these extremely bigoted and archaic assumptions about them and their needs. So in terms of that, empathy also, there's this irony around the lack of empathy for autistic people in, culturally in our society in general, and then, specifically, at CIIS, where we should be doing better. And this irony is that one of the most hateful stereotypes about autistic people is that autistic people lack empathy and lack something called theory of mind, which is the ability to understand other people's minds. And the way that works, a fellow autistic scholar, my British colleague, Dr. Damien Milton, came up with this wonderful term, the double empathy problem. And the way that works is when people are relating on equal footing, and they're coming and they think differently due to some sort of cultural difference, if they're relating on equal footing, it's understood that communication difficulties between them are the result of these differences between them and are everyone's responsibility. So if you are coming from the US and you have Anglo-American heritage or African-American heritage, you grew up as an English speaker in the US, and you're relating to somebody who grew up in China and grew up speaking Chinese and immersed in Chinese culture, well, there's going to be communication difficulties. The language is different, but also basic cultural assumptions are different from this US culture and Chinese culture. You're going to find these differences in cultural assumptions and what body language means and what the rhythms of conversation are and what gets stated explicitly and what's implicit. And both parties understand that. Oh, this person is from a very different culture. and with a different native language. So there are difficulties of understanding between us, and we both need to work extra hard at understanding each other. And that's, that's understood. There's going to be this gap of understanding, and that's just the nature of cultural difference. But when it's an autistic person and a non-autistic person who are having trouble understanding each other, the non-autistic person, because they're not pathologized, they're not a member of this pathologized and despised minority group, they have the luxury, the privilege of blaming the failures of communication entirely on the autistic person. And so you got two people with very different minds, with very different experiences on even a basic sensory level and basic cognitive processing style. But the non-autistic people, the non-autistic culture gets to say, oh, that's because there's something wrong with autistic people. If I don't understand an autistic person, it's because they have communication difficulties, they have communication deficits. And if an autistic person doesn't understand me, it's because they have empathy deficits. And so all of the burden of that gap in understanding and communication due to minds being different from each other gets dumped on the autistic person. And so autistic people get accused of communication and empathy deficits, as if that were a defining feature of being autistic. Of course, it's the non-autistic people in this scenario who actually have communication and empathy deficits, because autistic people are at least trying to bridge that gap. And non-autistic people are saying, oh no, I don't have to do anything to bridge that gap. It's your deficit. We just have to cure you. So that is, again, that whole stereotype is just an artifact of social inequality and perpetuates social inequality and systemic injustice and dehumanizes autistic people. And yet it is very commonplace in CIIS to assign textbooks that talk about autistic people lacking empathy or lacking theory of mind. It happens in the program I teach in. I hear students come into my class and they're like, hey, in this other class we took last semester, we heard, we read in the textbook that autistic people lack theory of mind or have trouble with cognitive empathy. And so that's commonplace, that's commonly taught as if it were a scientific fact rather than a symptom of social inequality at CIIS. And then, also, again, if you were advocating conversion therapy at CIIS, if you were advocating for gay conversion therapy at CIIS, so if you think your child might be gay, make sure they get conversion therapy to make them straight. I don't think that would go over very well in the CIIS community. I think a faculty member who taught that would be asked to stop teaching it. I don't think a faculty member would be hired at CIIS if their CV said, I'm a practitioner of gay conversion therapy. But conversion therapy for autistic people is extremely common. There's this whole, there's a multi-billion-dollar industry of something called ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis, which is conversion therapy for autistic people intended to force autistic children to imitate non-autistic children at the expense of their own long-term well-being. And it is the biggest civil rights issue for the autistic community right now. It is, ABA has inflicted horrific trauma on a couple generations of autistic people at this point, and fighting the ABA industry and trying to protect future generations of autistic children from being subjected to ABA is the #1 civil rights struggle the autistic community is engaged in right now. ABA is at CIIS, like, it's commonplace again in the psych programs developmental psych classes, psychopathology classes, for instructors to say, ABA is the gold standard of treatment for autism. Imagine if you said, gay conversion therapy is the gold standard of treatment for homosexuality, but perfectly acceptable. We hire ABA practitioners. I've seen adjunct faculty members where like their bio is like they're certified ABA practitioners. Again, we would not hire people who proudly advertise being practitioners of gay conversion therapy. And how does it feel? How does it feel for an autistic student to be told that the teacher who's teaching this class, where they'll learn about autism, among other things, is a practitioner of the horrifically abusive conversion therapy method that has traumatized thousands and thousands of autistic people, including possibly the autistic student themselves in the class? Like, that's certainly a highly unsafe situation for any autistic student. So again, what I'm saying all of this to get you all thinking, to get you all doing the inner work of empathy, and kind of trying to provide a little jump start here of doing that inner work and saying, how would I feel in this situation if I were an autistic person? How would I feel if it was a marginalized group that I belong to being talked about this way? How would I feel if I were being asked to learn about my own people from someone who is not one of us and who's made their career disparaging and traumatizing us? Because that's the situation that autistic students are in now. And so again, changing the conversation starts with us recognizing that and developing more empathy around it and thinking, do I really want to be a part of that? Do I really want to be a part of sending, perpetuating that message and perpetuating that kind of hostile environment for the autistic students in my classes, my autistic colleagues at CIIS? So that is my little inspirational message. And it's really the goal here again is I'm asking you to think about this, anytime you have occasion, anytime you're looking at, listening to how autistic people are being talked about at CIIS in the textbooks, when you're a faculty member and you're looking at, I'm going to assign this text. Well, what does it say? What does it say about autistic people? And what would it be like for an autistic person to be reading this about themselves? And do I want to perpetuate this sort of, is this what I want to perpetuate in the world? If I really think about how it would feel for me to be in that situation, having this sort of stigmatizing material perpetuate about me, being spoken about in a way that members of my community really don't want to be spoken about. So yeah, that's what I'm inviting, is this reflection that I hope will extend well beyond today. And I think at this point, I went on a little longer than I expected. Time always does tend to fly by, but at this point, I want to take questions. I think it's very important to teach the historical context, and it's just a matter of putting it in context. We wouldn't use the terms this way, these days. We wouldn't talk about people, and it's fine. It's just like if you got a textbook that talks about autistic people lacking theory of mind, and you want to assign the textbook because it has all this other useful information, assign it and just give your students the context. Like, look, it's got this archaic, oppressive stuff in it, and we have to recognize that it has been part of the discourse and is still in the process of changing. So it's similar, like, I think assigning historical material that uses, horrifically problematic language is fine, as long as you give the context. If we don't talk about it that way for a reason, it's shifted, and we can see how our perspective has evolved over time. In the case of Margaret Mahler's work, and a lot of other early work that used the term autistic, they weren't even talking about autistic people. Autistic was being used differently, and autism as a distinct diagnosis didn't come into being until the 1940s. So everything before that that uses autistic is using the term in a very different way from how it's used now. And so it's very simple to clarify that for students, I think. So in terms of resources, so your husband is older, right?
Yes.
And so his, everyone has their own particular struggles, and I guess we need to take a lot longer than we have, because to really point at the right resources, I would need to know exactly what the nature of the struggles were, and it's very different at different ages and for different people. The first thing to do is not assume that your husband is struggling because he's autistic, because that's, again, that assumption that being autistic is inherently a problem is exactly what the problem is. So when you talk about, the agitation and the reactivity and that sort of thing, I'm hearing, anxiety created by trauma. And we live in a society that traumatizes autistic people constantly.
Mm-hmm.
And the key to autistic well-being, I've found, is you don't try to treat people for being autistic, you treat the trauma and cultivate the resilience. So the idea that one of the problems that people run into when they get diagnosed as autistic is that they start thinking, oh, I need resources that are specifically for autistic people. But the best resources I've always found are not written for autistic people, because people mostly write garbage for autistic people. And so I would say what you want to look at is what are the particular struggles that your husband is having. If he's struggling with anxiety and such, then you want resources on dealing with anxiety and dealing with trauma. And that's, it doesn't work differently for autistic people. And all of the best, resources for healing and self-transformation and such that I've found were the ones that were not designed for autistic people. And so, yeah, I would say almost like in terms of every autistic person has their own different set of needs, just like every non-autistic person does. And as an autistic person, of course, one is often, been taught, to deny one's needs or not recognize what they are, because they're not those of the dominant majority. And so being able to alleviate the trauma and calm the anxiety and develop some ability to sit calmly with oneself and feel into what one actually needs, that's key. And then he can discover his own needs, because what happens otherwise, you read a book on, what makes things comfortable for autistic people, and there's such a variety. It's like, for some, you'll read like, okay, autistic people need like a lot of quiet, and very very quiet, subdued lighting, subdued sensory environment. That is not true of all of us. Some of us love intense sensory stimulation and are calmed by bright lights and loud music. And so rather than generalize, it really is about helping him finding the resources to calm the anxiety, to help him tune into what's actually going to make him feel better. Yeah. At the moment, there's no serious effort to do that. With the DSM-5, there was some reforming of the diagnostic criteria, and they're still not good. They're still kind of backward, but better than they used to be. The reason, the reason even the people who are against pathologizing autism aren't pushing really hard to remove it from the DSM is right now, the diagnosis is still necessary for some people in order to be protected against discrimination or to get accommodations at school or in the workplace. And so until there's enough of a systemic shift that you can get that stuff without, get those basic accommodations in life without the diagnosis needs to be in place until then. And so it's this complicated, like, interlocking system of how do you do it. Very similar, trans people are in a very similar situation right now, is where in order to get access to treatments, gender transition, medical care, you need that diagnosis of gender dysphoria, and it's improved, because it used to be you had to be diagnosed with gender identity disorder, which is awful. And now the diagnosis is gender dysphoria, which is a little better. Like, the problem is, defined in a less stigmatizing way, but still you're in the situation where you still need the diagnosis to get the services and get the care. And ideally that will change, and then it can be removed from the DSM entirely, but removing it at this point would create problems until the other pieces of the system have also changed. So that's why no one's making that big push yet. I want to throw in there, by the way, you reminded me, in terms of the comparison between gay conversion therapy and ABA, it's actually not just analogous, they actually have the same roots. So they were developed together there were a bunch of work done at UCLA and UC Irvine back in like the early 70s. And they had the same group of people had two projects running, the same little group of behaviorists had two projects running. And one was developing ABA, developing this behaviorist system for autistic kids. And the other was called the Feminine Boy Project, and was doing the exact same thing with boys whose parents were worried they were gay because they were engaging in so-called feminine behaviors, like being kind and nurturing and playing with dolls. And so the work of the Feminine Boy Project changed the face of gay conversion therapy and became the prevailing model of gay conversion therapy. And funding for it in the UC system dried up when homosexuality was taken out of the DSM. But so they actually were developed, modern gay conversion therapy and ABA were actually developed side by side at the same time by the same people. But in terms of alternatives, in terms of what to do, it's better to do nothing than ABA, I think. But sensory integration therapy is key. And this is the key thing, is that parents freak out and think some treatment is necessary because there's such this emphasis on developmental timelines and such, and they see their kids struggle to meet these societal expectations and school expectations of meeting particular developmental timelines, and they worry. Of course, the ABA industry preys on that worry, preys on that your child's never going to master basic toilet training, or if we don't give them ABA. The difficulties that autistic kids are facing are around having an extremely complex and intense sensory experience. And so ABA actually ends up doing harm there because it teaches the kids to suppress their natural coping strategies for dealing with that sensory experience. Sensory integration therapy is great. Sensory integration therapy is teaching kids body awareness and how to integrate their sensory experience. And when they do that, they have more bandwidth to attend to other aspects of their development. And so that is the groundwork. And there's other things, that benefit different kids. Different kids benefit in different ways, play-based therapies. There's a lovely one called Floor Time that's play-based. But from my perspective, the core of helping any autistic kid with any issues they're running into, the core of it should be sensory integration therapy. That should be the foundation, and then everything is built on top of how, whatever else we do to help raise this child is going to be easier if they're not overwhelmed by their sensory experience.
Thank you. Thank you all for
being
here.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was delightful to be in the space. I learned so much. Every time I listen to you, I learned so much. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
All right. Bye, everyone.